Guess what? Today we get to talk about someplace we actually got to be at for a long time.
Yeah. Lived right next to Fort Stanwix.
Yes.
In Rome, New York.
Shout out to everybody who works there.
Yes.
Shout out. Yes. You know who you are. So yes, this place is near and dear to us, and we're going to be quite biased in our discussion of it. Welcome to Unearthly Upstate Season 2!
Hooray!
Yay! I'm Mari.
I'm Matthew.
And today we are going to talk about one of the most important forts in the Revolutionary War. It was the fort that never surrendered. We're talking about Fort Stanwix.
Yes. When you travel into Rome, that is Rome, New York, from either the interstate or Highway 49, you cross over the barge canal that replaced the section of the Erie Canal in Rome. And the road you're on forks in the middle. And ahead of you from there is a surprising sight. It's a large wooden fort. And it looks out of place with a hardware store next to it, a laundromat, and a couple of hotels and a few restaurants nearby. But what you've discovered is Fort Stanwix. And it's fitting that you would find it at that intersection because before it stood its ground, did not let the British take it over, the fort stood at a different intersection, at the portage of two major waterways. All right. This is not the original fort, okay? And it wasn't the only fort in the area. This portage was called the Oneida Carry, a piece of land between the Mohawk River, Wood Creek, and it was important to the trade of the area. Now, the British built multiple smaller forts nearby, and in 1758 they built the larger one, the one that was the first Fort Stanwix, named after British General John Stanwix. This allowed the British to control all that entire area of the Oneida Carry.
Apologies, Honey just purred right into my microphone. But we're not going to re-record that. Honey's giving her opinion about this place.
No, we're not going to worry about that.
So, now, sorry about the purring, folks.
You can learn about the history of the fort by starting a tour at the Willett Center. And then continue to the fort to either finish the tour or explore on your own. And you might see a one-legged man in the bastions. Or you might hear fife music when nobody's playing them. Or a drum. And you might see children at play in the ditch outside the fort, or ducking around corners. Some people claim they hear the cry of a woman. All these spirits claim to inhabit the fort.
I'll stop you there for a second. Yeah, there's a lot of paranormal researchers that go to the fort, and we've heard stories of interesting investigations and other stories of people that really should have researched their history before coming in there. A common misconception from people is if they see somebody, a ghost supposedly in a white powdered wig, that it's immediately George Washington. George Washington was never at the fort.
He never visited it. Yeah.
There are a few other candidates if they want to go Revolutionary War. I'm thinking more of like Herkimer. It could have been it could have been Herkimer. It could have been Willett.
Right.
The powdered wig was a very common style choice at the time. And again, Honey's purring right in the microphone. So this assumption, it must have been George Washington. No, there were other people associated with the fort that it's more likely it could have been. I would vote with her, even though I don't think Herkimer ever stepped foot in the fort. He, in a episode coming up, in fact, the next episode, we're going to mention an event he was involved in that is directly related to Fort Stanwix that makes him a real badass candidate for it. And we will go into more of Herkimer later, too. Yes. But there are other candidates, I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm also going to state this, too. They're not just necessarily Revolutionary War ghosts.
No,
Yeah.
a lot of Rome, New York stood over the site of Fort Stanwix ever since the development of the city, and you might be seeing some of those ghosts. Who knows? You know,
Yep.
there's a lot of time in between when the fort was left to rot after the Revolutionary War and the time that the national parks, was developed. But a bit of history. Okay, in 1768, Fort Stanwix was the site of a treaty conference between the British and the Iroquois. But by this time, by the time of the treaty, the fort had become dilapidated and it was abandoned and left to ruin. The next time the fort was occupied was on July 12th, 1776, when colonial troops under the command of Colonel Elias Dayton began to rebuild it, and they renamed it Fort Schuyler, after the architect who was helping them out. But they still called it Fort Stanwix. Now, Colonel Peter Gansevoort took over command of the fort on May 3rd, 1777, and the siege of Fort Stanwix, or Schuyler, began on August 3rd, 1777. So, Brigadier General Barry St. Leger, one of my favorite British generals, must have had quite a well-stocked drinks cabinet. Oh, God, he made so many drunken decisions.
Oh, my gosh,
He later attacked the fort with a force of 1,500 men as part of a three-pronged campaign to divide the American colonies. Now, Gansevoort refused the terms of the surrender offered by the British, and the siege began.
Okay, we're gonna have to expand on this a bit. Yeah, St. Ledger. Okay,
Yeah.
a good military commander will take all the information that's given to him and utilize it to his best advantage to move the troops to attack or whatever he needs to do. St. Ledger, instead, the native allies come up to him and say, "Hey, the fort's rebuilt. It's fully stocked.
Yeah.
Are you sure you want to go there?"
Yeah.
And he basically went, "Oh, you're natives. You don't know what you're talking about." But then the Germans that were helping him out were like, "Dude, the fort's been rebuilt. It's a wooden fort. Where are your incendiary rounds?" St. Ledger's like, "I don't need them. The fort's not built." He refused to listen to the information that was given to him.
Whereas Gansevoort is quoted to be determined to defend Fort Stanwix or Fort Schuyler to the last extremity, and you'll see that quote in big letters up there in the Willett Center. St. Ledger was determined to fight a very British campaign and ignore all the intelligence from his native and German allies. Yes.
Yeah, he totally refused to listen to him. Even though they had the right information, he refused to listen to them because they weren't British.
Oh, yeah.
Basically, what it boiled down to.
This is a British campaign, and we're not, that's the way we're going to do it.
Now, there is a rumor that the first time the flag of the United States was flown, it was flown on August 3rd, 1777, when the siege began. And it flew over Fort Schuyler, but it's more likely the flag that was flown only had 13 stripes, an early version of the flag of New York, or perhaps the Grand Union flag.
Yeah, I got to explain what the Grand Union
is.
Now, the Grand Union is the red and white stripes for the original 13 colonies, but in replacing the star field, where the final settled upon American flag would sit, they had the British flag right there, where the star field would have been. But they switched that out for the flag that everybody knows about the stars, the circle of stars in that area, in that field of the flag, because they were afraid that it might be mistaken for an enemy a banner of some kind. And so, and the original flag that flew over Fort Stanwix at this time was a flag with red, white, and blue stripes, but it was red, white, and blue stripes that was taken from scraps of old clothing. The blue in the flag.
So no Betsy Ross here.
No, the blue in the flag was taken from strips from a cloak from a captured British officer, which is interesting. They captured that cloak and tore it into strips and then worked it in along with the red and white stripes. I think that's an interesting history. And so if you're ever down there during the days of siege at Fort Stanwix, you see that flag, that red, white, and blue striped flag flying over. It's one of America's earliest flags.
Yes.
And you can find those flags for sale.
Yeah, exactly. Now, a few days before August 3rd, General Nicholas Herkimer, who you're going to find out was quite the badass, ordered his militia to muster at Fort Dayton on the Mohawk River, 50 miles east of Fort Stanwix. He learned that British were planning to attack the fort, so he left Fort Dayton on August 4th with 900 men. But unfortunately, they never make it to the fort for the Battle of Oriskany, which we will discuss in the next episode. So let's just say their relief was their relief never could make it there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Gansevoort ordered Lieutenant Colonel Marnus Willett to create a diversion. Willett's men snuck out and found the British and Indian encampments that at the time had been left empty. Willett, exactly. Willett and his men took whatever they could, and everything they got their hands on was like kettles, clothing, muskets, spears, tomahawks, regimental colors, papers belonging to the British officers, and they freed any and all prisoners they found. And the prisoners at the camp informed Gansevoort about what had happened at Oriskany and the size and strength of the British siege at the fort. And the British and their native American allies were really demoralized after this. The ransacking of their camps and the aftermath of the Battle of Oriskany really left the British native allies with nothing. And hearing reports that another relief column was heading toward the fort, the relief column was led by Major General Benedict Arnold.
Yep. Which is my theory of the one-legged man.
Yeah. Okay. Rumors reached the British about the size of the column, but which was overinflated. Estimates of about 3,000 men reached the British, but I don't know how. With the trails and everything that were available at the time, how would you move that kind of column through there? It
kind of makes you wonder if some of the people, especially like the native allies, we're going to get into this a bit more with Oriskany, if they did exaggerate.
Right.
To kind of get, maybe, because now because, all right, so now St. Leger, gets there, the fort's fully built.
Yeah.
Oriskany happens very close, right there, and Oriskany is demoralizing for both sides. It wasn't just demoralizing for the British, it was demoralizing for the colonists as well. And horrifying for what happened with the Native American allies.
The Native allies left.
Yeah, they took off, and I don't blame them.
And after the deaths of several chiefs at Oriskany. And, they are promised all this booty. Yeah. That's the thing about the difference between state and tribal warfare. In tribal warfare, there's booty to be had. You got to have all the...
And there was also this problem going on right now.
Which is one of the reasons why you do it.
There was also this kind of a civil war going on with the Five Nations. That's why you had these tribes who had been allies of each other and had joined together under one... I think confederacy is the wrong word, but that's the word that comes to my head. Were now split. And it had to do with some political things that were going on within the tribes. So you had former allies, these tribes, and I don't want to mention the names of which tribes because I'm probably going to screw up who was with who, but basically just to say that these used to be tribes that were unified, and now they were split.
Loosely.
And you had the half, I think like 3 of them were with the colonists and 2 were with the British, or it could have been vice versa. But
we don't have that information.
I don't have the information in front of us. I'm just trying to remember from memory. That's why I don't want to name which tribe was which, because I don't want to screw it up.
Information overload, bringing this episode together.
But Oriskany was kind of, for them, was related to all that drama going behind the scenes, which the British and the colonists did take advantage of. I mean, they, so yeah, this really...
Yeah, and St. Leger cut his losses.
Oh, yeah, St. Leger took
retreated to join Burgoyne's camp at Fort Ticonderoga on August 27th, 1777.
And we know how well that went.
Yes. Setting up Saratoga.
Yep.
This set back the British, and they did not bounce back from it.
Yep.
Spotty. The bounce back was spotty at best.
Yeah.
And not quickly. When they met the colonists at Saratoga, they were defeated.
Yes.
And Fort Stanwix was garrisoned until 1788.
Oh, 1781?
No, sorry. Fort Stanwix was garrisoned until 1781, when on May 13th, the fort burnt down. And the troop, well, part of it burnt.
Yeah.
And, first it washed out. And it was very wet. Mm-hmm. But then it burnt, which is kind of suspicious. Mm-hmm. There's some controversy over whether or not the troops, some of the troops, set it on fire themselves.
Yeah, exactly.
So that the command structure would be forced to abandon the fort. Anyway, the troops left after the burning on May 13th, and the troops left, and the fort again was left to the elements. Yep. And by mid 1800s, Rome, New York was growing up around the site where the old fort had stood, and the town needed land for a growing city, and parts of the city began to occupy where the fort once stood. Now, in 1935, the Fort Stanwix Act was signed, and this meant that soon the land would have to be donated to the government, and it turned into Fort Stanwix National Monument. This process began in the 60s. The city of Rome bought many run-down properties that now sat on the former site of the fort. They turned those 16 acres over to the National Park Service. After the land was cleared, archaeologists excavated the site, identifying buildings found within the original structure. By the way, there was one of the original hearths in the northwest bastion of the fort. Mm-hmm. That's under climate-controlled conditions, and you can go visit that. Mm-hmm. Okay, and many artifacts were found as well. Starting in 1973, the state of New York and the National Park Service began to reconstruct Fort Stanwix / Schuler, completing the first phase in 76, just in time for the American Bicentennial celebration. And in 1978, the second phase was completed, presenting a finished national monument.
Now, last year, me and Matt got to see I would say it was a lecture, so much, about the gentleman who owned the company that came in to do the outer walls of the fort. Mm-hmm. His family owned a company that built log homes, and they had a certain way of doing pressure treating with the logs that was perfect for building these reconstructions of the forts. Mm-hmm. And so he was hired, basically kind of a local guy, because he wasn't that far away. He was up somewhere in the Adirondacks, if I remember right. I can't remember exactly where. So his company was hired to do the wood for the fort. Now, there is a big difference between the old fort and the new fort. The big difference is inside those walls of the new fort are concrete.
Yes, they poured concrete forms. It's kind of a fort within a fort.
Yeah.
So they had to pour the concrete forms first to build sort of the endoskeleton of it, and then
they put the wood on it. So, but it's interesting how him helping them out building Fort Stanwix opened him up to do this reconstruction all over the United States.
Yeah, once they saw what a great job they did, and I was most impressed on how they were able to evenly and symmetrically put in all those sections of the wood. And it all started with, doing the concrete forms right, first of all, and putting in all the modern infrastructure.
And I think because he was the only company that had the right equipment to do this properly. And like I said, opened it up to him. He's done forts in Florida and Georgia as well.
All over everything.
Yeah, and so that's become kind of a thing. They still build log homes up there, by the way. But,
naturally.
Yeah, but...
Dude was a millionaire.
Yeah, but that was very interesting how he got involved with this.
That was great. Yeah, and he gave that presentation over at the Historical Society.
Which is not that far from the fort.
Just a stone's throw.
You just go around go around the Catholic Church, and there it is.
There she is.
In fact, in front of the Historical Society is Gainsworth Park, and guess there's a statue of Gainsworth in there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting things to note about Rome is as you go through Rome, you're going to see a lot of historical markers. A lot of them will tell you where the lines were during the battle, during the siege. And I think I mentioned it before in the program. If I haven't, if I have, you're gonna hear it again. They still find artifacts all through the city from the siege and the battles.
In recent years,
Yeah.
a farmer just plowed up a 3-pound cannon.
Yeah, I was
barrel.
there when they brought it in. That was awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic.
So yeah, people find cannonballs all the time. They find remnants of this all the time. Yeah.
Old furniture off of muskets.
Yep.
Day-to-day utensils. And as many homeowners that say they have spirits in their house will tell you, when you start to do any type of reconstruction, that's when ghosts appear. Okay, that's where the unearthly element comes in.
But
okay.
there are some great stories of the fort we should share.
Oh, yes.
You know, first, okay, maybe we'll explain what type of fort this is.
Yeah,
we've just been saying fort. But Fort Stanwix is a particular type of fort. It's what's known as a star fort.
Yes.
And what makes a star fort interesting is the points of the star. Now,
bastions.
Bastions. It could be anywhere from 4. It could be 6, I've seen. I think I've seen up to 8 bastions. They are used for the lookouts. And if you go look from above, it looks like kind of like a star. Now, Stanwix is only a 4. 1. Right. Ontario's a 4, correct?
I think so. Don't quote me on it.
I think they're 4. They might be a 5. But I've seen examples, like there's one I saw from the Netherlands, which was like a 6. They had 6 bastions on it.
Yeah, and they can have multiple layers, too.
Yes. And the fort is often, it's surrounded by a ditch. Now, this ditch is not filled in water, so it's not a moat. It's a ditch. It actually was used, that's where the families lived.
Yeah, they could not house them inside the fort.
Right. The families lived there. And just outside the ditch was where they kept the animals until the British showed up.
Yeah, they did it. Where the Willett Center stands, they had a couple of small barns.
Yeah.
But when the British were approaching, they had to raise that area. That is, they had to destroy a slaughterer take in the animals that were in the barns, and then just destroy the structures, because they didn't want to leave anything that would give any sort of aid to their enemies.
And as you walk up to the fort, you might not see the ditch at first, which is part of the layout of the fort. Imagine you're coming in full tilt on a horse, and you don't see that ditch till you get there. This is not a small ditch. This horse is not going to jump over this ditch.
No.
This horse is going to end up tumbling down into the ditch, and if there's, I want to say spikes, but there's a different word for them.
Yeah.
Those defensive measures. What are those called?
Yeah, exactly.
I'm making a motion with my hands here, folks.
No, they're some of the obstacles. You hit an obstacle that's made of wood. It's very, and
it's got sharp, pointy ends.
Sharp, pointy ends on it, and you'll run your horse right onto it. And there are sharpened logs. Yeah, not sticks, logs.
No, logs.
And that ditch raises the walls of the fort up, and from the embrasures, that is where the barrels of the cannons are pointed out of. There's a very sharp drop down. I'd like to say like 20 feet. And so it's a pretty deep ditch.
Let's put it this way: there are a lot of Pokemon Go stops at Fort Stanwix National Monument, and there's one I never got. Because when I went back to start doing Pokemon Go, they were doing reconstruction on the one side. They still are, as the time
we were
recording.
there recently.
We were there recently, still doing construction. So you couldn't really get to it inside the fort. Don't even try to get to it on the outside of the fort. That ditch is too wide.
There's no way in.
There's no way to get. So there is one Pokemon stop I never got at Fort Stanwix.
No, yeah.
But Pokemon Go players, it's a great place to go. It is.
Going back to the ghosts of it.
Oh, yeah.
There are the girls who were murdered next to the scalping tree.
The scalping tree, yes.
There's the soldier who was killed when he went outside the fort to try and catch a horse. And then there's the 5 men who deserted the fort after the siege and were caught by some colonial native allies, brought back to the fort, and then executed in the ditch.
Yep. And the interesting thing is, when you hear all the ghost stories, nobody mentions seeing any ghosts in the ditch. If there any place to be haunted, it would be the ditch.
It would be the ditch, yeah.
But like I said, if you are seeing ghosts, there might not necessarily be a Revolutionary War. I mean, there was a good century there where Rome, the city of Rome, sat on that spot.
I was always tempted, to dress up in my small clothes and put like red spots on my shirt and then just go wandering around in the ditch. That would have been good during that would have been good during the haunting thing. Right.
Yeah, every fall around Halloween they do a haunting one. I helped out with the medical story, but it's really good because there's no powered lights on in the fort, and you're led through by lantern. And every room you go to is lit by lantern or fireplace. So
it's really eerie.
It's very eerie, and the stories are just as eerie. The whole premise is you're coming in from seeking shelter, and then they're trying to find Willet, I believe it is.
Yeah.
And so you go through the fort as they're trying. Well, come on, we'll go check out this, and you hear these different stories. And my favorite story. I wish I could remember the name of the guy. Him and his buddy went out fishing, wasn't it?
Well, for some reason.
They were outside the fort for whatever reason, went out with their dog. Dog comes back to the fort, like Lassie, something's wrong.
Timmy fell down the well?
Yeah. Other guys went out there to find these guys, and they had been scalped.
Yeah.
The one survived. He was scalped, but he survived.
Yeah, he was one of the captains.
And his name eludes me. So please respond in Facebook or on our webpage what his name was. But the story is he healed, but he suffered from a nervousness afterwards.
Well, yeah, that was PTSD.
So he retired to Albany with his nurse, but he was known to go down the streets, go up to people, whip his hat off, and go, "You want to see something?" Whip his hat off and show him his scalped head.
Oh, oh yeah. And then there are the wood foragers.
Oh yeah.
Who went out that winter, and then were caught by Joseph Brandt's raiding party.
Right. Joseph Brandt was a native ally. Yeah, explain that.
Massacred to a man. All they found were their shoes with no buckles.
Yeah. Yeah. There were some pretty horrific things that happened around the fort, and it's interesting. None of the ghosts that are cited are actually related to that.
Well, talking of relations, this is basically a civil war going on between colonialists and loyalists in the same region.
And like I said before, with the tribes who had been allies and had under one government, and now they're fighting amongst each other too. Yeah. So it's very interesting history. I mean, if you go up there, also visit the native sites that are up there, the native museums. Just off Turning Stone, there's the one for the Oneidas. I highly recommend going there.
Yes.
A very good history of the Oneidas. And when anyone who works for Turning Stone has to go through that museum and learn the history, and they do discuss what happened at Fort Stanwix for a little bit because they were involved. But I always found an interesting thing, and I got to see it, is Turning Stone, the casino, is named after a rock they had.
Right. So
when they would move their village, this rock would follow them, and when the rock was put in place, it was home. Okay.
Right.
I saw the rock because that was part of the tour, being a new employee.
Sure, it's the rock.
It's the rock. It is the rock. The interesting part is it's a rock that is not geologically. There's no way
it's not native.
It's not native to Central New York.
So it was imported from another part.
So it came from somewhere else. Yeah. So that's why it held such importance. I mean, you look at it, you go, it's just a rock, but when you start hearing the history about it, it's like, oh, that's kind of cool.
And that is a technically a geological term.
But there's also
not native rock.
There's the Onondaga in Syracuse also have a similar museum. There's the Mohawks have a similar museum. So if you want to get into more history of the Native American ends, there's plenty of places to go and look at. This.
And of course, any war is fertile territory for ghost stories.
So okay, let's discuss the ghosts before we finish this off. So we got the children playing. That's a pretty common one. Now, I'm going to say where they're doing the reconstruction right now on the fort. That part of the fort did creep me out, but I never saw a ghost. It's just something about that end of the fort that creeped me out. I don't know what it is. Maybe where it was laid. Maybe, the fact that it does seem kind of disused back there. It always would creep me out.
Perhaps like Herbert Lovecraft, you were unnerved by some of the angles.
Maybe. That could definitely be it. Because the funny thing is, you go into the hospital / gunpowder store room.
Isn't that an odd pairing?
This is true.
Yes, there's a place in the Southwest Bastion was the bomb-proof. Now, that is a technical term. And the bomb-proof was also the area where they had the hospital.
Yeah, they kept the patients right next to the gunpowder.
But the story of Fort Stanwix has a bright spot on it. And there was a woman who gave birth in the bomb-proof.
During the siege. Yep. So the fort never surrendered, and if it hadn't held its ground, Saratoga would never have happened.
Yep.
Think about that. This little fort that's just there to protect the Oneida Carry, which we've mentioned a few times how important it was.
Yes.
It's important to the history of the Erie Canal. It's important to the Stanwix. Absolutely. So you got if it hadn't held its ground, if Saratoga wouldn't have happened, and we would not have had our first major victory.
Absolutely.
Victory.
It could be that the reconstruction of the fort brought back the spirits that called the fort home.
Yes.
Fort Stanwix is located at 112 East Park Street, Rome, New York, 13440. It sits between Black River Boulevard, North James Street, Erie Boulevard, and Park Street. Wow, that's quite a lot. Confluence there. The Willett Center is open at 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day except on Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's. And the fort is open most of the year, often closed in the winter due to the weather, of course. And the National Park website, www.nps.gov /FOST, F-O-S-T, for Fort Stanwix.
Yep. And, if you go there, say hi to all the rangers. All of them are very informed. They can give you more of a history of why it was such an important trade area. And that's why the British wanted it back in the Revolutionary War. They knew they needed it for the supply runs.
The position of Fort Stanwix was strategically and tactically advantageous in both wars, both the French and Indian, or 7 Years' War, if you like, and the American War for Independence, because of its location in the Carry, as it guarded the Carry. And everybody knew that Fort Stanwix was pivotal to any sort of strategic or tactical advantage you might have against your enemy.
So I definitely stop by the fort. It's free. The fort is free.
Yeah, it's what's nice about Fort Stanwix. Unlike a lot of the other parks or historical sites in the national park system, Fort Stanwix is free. But they do have a nice gift shop. And, there's a lot of stuff. Recommend. And by the way, that's where our oldest Miles picked up my copy of von Steuben's, or von Steuben's, rather. There's a lot of controversy over that. Von Steuben's drill manual.
And I'm biased because that's where I volunteer. I volunteer in the gift shop in the Willett Center.
Well, I volunteered as a private in the 3rd New York for 6 consecutive years at Fort Stanwix. I loved it. I loved it.
All right, so that's Fort Stanwix. Like I said, we're very biased about it, but you see why it's very important for American history. And it could be haunted. I can't say I was ever affected by the ghost there. But then I'm gonna, if you do see a ghost, it might not be from the Revolutionary War.
Although during the couple Halloween specials ago, I did get to play a ghost. In one of the, I had my own scenario, and it was about the woodcutters.
Oh, okay. All right, so that's Unearthly Upstate for this week. Thank you for coming back to season 2
to our ghastly podcast.
Yes, and have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Unearthly Upstate. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Patreon, and on our webpage. We are also on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, Podbean, Google Podcasts, and CastBox. Please like, share, and review on your favorite platform. Unearthly Upstate is an Animator Liar production. The show is produced by Mari and Matt Manette, with purring provided by Honey and Lloyd. Research and writing by Mari Manette. Music is by Kevin MacLeod, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license. Unless otherwise stated in the episode, the places mentioned in the broadcast are not paid or contact us for any type of promotion. Please check out our webpage for credit and sources for the episode. Thank you.